We go to gym, but I'm not as religious about that. Although this time of year, I start to. Well, yeah, it's easier.
Wow. We've got 5 on climate action. Dave on. All right, we'll get started here. Welcome everyone to the December 3rd City of Everett Planning Commission meeting. Could I have roll call, please?
Chair Beck,
Here.
Commissioner Holland,
Here.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Here.
Commissioner McGinn, Commissioner Lark.
Here.
Okay, has everybody had an opportunity to review the minutes? Does anybody have any comments on the minutes? Changes? Commissioner Zelinski?
Yeah, I just have one comment. It's on page 2. About the middle of the page, under Commissioner discussion, it says Commissioner Yanisek asked if the issue was housing or economics. And the next sentence is, Mr. Collier responded, but it doesn't say anything about what the nature of the response was.
I
think that would be helpful to fill that in.
Okay.
Does anybody want to entertain a adoption or move to adopt with the corrections?
I would so move.
I would like to see what the corrections are prior to adoption. I think that's
Okay, so we'll adopt those at a later time, or?
That's fine.
Next
Okay.
meeting.
All right, so then we'll move along now, and does anybody have any reports?
I just have a self-aggrandizing one. I ran a marathon on Sunday, and I'm still very tired.
I have to ask, was that the Seattle Marathon? I had a friend who is in the 60-plus category. He did it in under 4 hours. I was so impressed.
That is moving.
That is impressive.
Any other reports?
No report.
None for me.
All right. Staff comments?
Yes, Alan Giffen, Planning Director. Wanted 2 things. One, there will be no meeting 2 weeks from tonight. The 17th will not have a meeting, so this will be our last meeting of this year. And also wanted to remind the Commission of the boards and commissions reception a week from Thursday, 4:30, Everett Station for city boards and commissions. That's it.
Okay, so at this time, is there anyone who would like to speak to an issue that is not on the agenda? I have not had anybody sign up, but if you would like to come forward at this time, please do so. Okay. Seeing none, then we'll go ahead and move on to item number 1, the Climate Action Plan.
Good evening, Karen Stewart, Environmental Planner. So tonight is the culmination of a draft climate action plan that hopefully you all received a copy of that in your mailing. And it's also available online for the public. So this is a draft that you will be reviewing tonight and hopefully considering coming up with a recommendation and sending it on to the City Council. Staff has drafted a resolution for your consideration tonight. And also it's an opportunity for you to hear from the public on the draft plan. So tonight we've got Britton Richardson here from Cascadia Consulting Group, who's their lead analyst and has been working with the city staff on putting this plan together. She has a brief presentation. Hold your questions until she's gotten through the presentation. And then, of course, then you'll have your public hearing, and then she and I and Bob Bolerjack are available if you have questions. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Karen. So I'm Britton Richardson. I'm from Cascadia Consulting Group, and like Karen said, I'm the lead analyst for this work. I came out October 15th and presented the draft actions and strategies for this plan, and today we have a full draft plan to review. So I'm just going to walk through a little recap of what's been done so far, and then walk through the overall structure of the plan itself, and then open for questions. So like I said, a brief recap of the purpose, scope, and timeline for the Climate Action Plan, and then I'll go into a high-level overview of the draft cap structure and content. So let's begin. So the purpose and goals of this plan are to provide a foundation for long-term climate resilience planning. So we think of this as phase one of a long-term process. So we're developing a strategic roadmap and a menu of climate mitigation options that City Council can later prioritize and create timelines for and implementation strategies for. One of the primary goals for this work is to ensure that this climate action plan captures the Everett community's priorities and concerns. The focus of the climate action plan is mostly on mitigation actions and strategies. This is because this is the area of greatest opportunity for the city. The city is right now doing a lot of work in terms of adaptation, so we wanted to focus on where there's the most opportunity and potential for impact. The plan is also focused mostly on community actions, so things that affect the community more broadly, rather than municipal actions. There are a few municipal actions, but it's mostly community-based actions. And when I say municipal actions, I mean government operations-focused climate work. And like I said, this is a platform and roadmap for future work. So you'll notice that some of the actions aren't incredibly specific, and that's just because this is more strategic than tactical at this point. Implementation details will have to be worked out in a later phase of the work. And the focus areas of the plan are transportation, electrification, the green economy, compact multimodal land use, and governance. And just a recap of the timeline for this work. So we kicked off the project August 15th. We attended a planning commission meeting on September 3rd to get initial feedback for the work. That got rolled into our work into the October 15th public workshop and planning commission meeting, which I came to and presented the draft strategies and actions. We rolled that feedback into what we're presenting today. And so right now we're at the December 3rd public hearing and planning commission meeting. So we're presenting the draft climate action plan that we've put together. And then the next stage would be presenting this to City Council for approval. So with that, I'll move into the climate action plan overview itself and talk about the structure of the plan and some details while reviewing it. So the general structure of the plan, the page numbers are listed on the left of this diagram. It starts with the plan at a glance. So this is basically an executive summary. If you don't have a lot of time, this is a good place to go. It lists all of the relevant details of the plan in a quick format. Then there's the introduction, the climate change in Everett section, the mitigation strategies and actions, which is the real meat of the plan. Then it moves into the implementation and evaluation section, the what you can do section, and then the appendices. And I'll speak to those sections soon. So the introduction, if you have it in front of you, it's on page 8. And it really lays the groundwork for the meat of the plan, which is the strategies and actions. So it describes why the climate action plan has been pursued, the vision that we're working towards as a community, the plan overview, so the organization of the plan itself, and then also how the plan was developed. That includes a timeline where key feedback opportunities were provided. And then there's also the greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, which I presented on last time. And then a section on building on a foundation, so kind of a progress to date of what the city has already done in terms of climate efforts. Then the plan moves into the climate change in Everett section, which is on page 13 if you wanted to reference it. And this is an overview of the potential impacts of climate change on Everett, and I presented on that last time as well. And it covers these different climate change impacts that could be facing Everett soon. It also gives an overview of Everett's community greenhouse gas emissions, so what Everett's contribution to climate change is. And this was summarized based on a prior analysis that was done by New Energy Cities and Stockholm Institute. It was done in 2014, so that we summarized a prior analysis for that. So this is the meat of the plan. This is the mitigation strategies and actions, and they're on page 21, or they start on page 21. And it's divided into these focus areas that I already mentioned. So you'll see a focus area, and then you'll see a goal listed, and within that goal, there's a table structure that has all of the strategies and actions in the plan. And I will say that the actions are, you'll see both low-hanging fruit there, so things that can be implemented pretty easily and maybe pretty cheaply to develop momentum at first. And then there's also some actions that are meant to create systemic change and set the city up for future progress. You'll see in the plan that all of the strategies and actions are organized in this table format. So I'm just going to go through how to read this table and interpret that so that it's easy to look at. So it starts with the goal name. All of the goals are listed above the table. And then the strategy name and number is in light blue within the table. Then everything after that strategy name is an action, and more detail on each action is provided. So there's the action ID, there's the city lead, so the department within the city that would be responsible for implementing the action, potential benefits that the action might provide, which I'll go into a little more detail on what those benefits are, and then whether it's a community or municipal focused action. And then any action that's highlighted in yellow are suggested priority actions based on that evaluation of benefits that we did, but they're just a suggestion. So there's a lot of icons used in these tables, and this is just a visual that helps interpret what those different icons are. The first row of this visual shows the M and the C, and then the accommodation of M and C. That's indicating whether the action's municipally focused or community focused. All of the other icons relate to different benefits that were evaluated. So we qualitatively evaluated every action that's included in this plan according to these various benefits. The ones that ranked the highest will have an icon for the respective benefit that we're looking at. So if the action scored very high in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential, you would see that icon in the table next to that action. And the different benefits that were evaluated are greenhouse gas emission reduction potential, public health benefits, equity benefits, cost and affordability, feasibility, resilience, economic growth, and then leadership opportunity. And then lastly is the plan conclusion. We conclude with a section on the implementation and evaluation. This section really speaks to the fact that this is phase 1 of a planning effort, and that a later phase 2, would have to plan more of the implementation elements. So really looking at who's the key person that's responsible for these actions, what's the timeline of each of the actions, what are the funding opportunities available, and also some KPIs to assess progress along the way. So we, in Appendix C, provide an implementation and evaluation framework that city staff can use to do that planning work down the road once we're diving into implementation of these actions. The section after that is the what you can do section, and that provides some actions that individuals can take within the community to lower their impact to climate change, in addition to the actions that are presented in the plan. Then there's the appendices. This has a lot of detail, so if you're interested in exploring some of the public feedback that was received in greater detail, this includes that. So Appendix A has a summary of the public feedback received throughout the process. Appendix B has the public open house boards that we took pictures of on October 15th. Appendix C has the implementation and evaluation frameworks I mentioned earlier. And then Appendix D has the multi-criteria analysis results. And what that is the evaluation that we use to assign those benefits to the different actions in the tables. So it has more detail on the exact rankings that came out of that evaluation. So that is my overview of the plan. I wanted to be quick so that we can move to the public hearing and comments. In terms of next steps, we'll incorporate any input that we received here into the final climate action plan. And then the final climate action plan would hopefully be presented to City Council in mid-December, so in a few weeks, or January 2020. And are there any questions for me?
Does anyone have questions? Commissioner Zelinski?
Yes, I just have a question on the math involved in Table 1 on page 18. There seems to be some, or either I'm reading the table wrong or there's some math errors in there, because there's towards the bottom of the list of the listing of costs and so on. I'm looking at the increased health costs from coal-fired emissions, and I'm seeing, and like in the first one for the year 2020, 19 billion.
That's the table on the economic impacts of climate change?
It's on page 18.
I don't have it in front of me, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yeah, so we actually noticed this too. This is from an outside source, and I'm not sure, we checked the numbers and verified that they are exactly what the outside source is providing. I'm not sure if there's other additional costs that they evaluated that get rolled into the total that they're just not calling out individually, and maybe that's why there's a difference in the.
Well, just looking strictly at those two lines, that one and the total are obviously inconsistent. So,
Yeah, we could look at that again.
There's also 1.6 in the corner is bullion, which I don't think they're talking about the stock.
That is true. Good point. Yeah, yeah, it does look like the decimal point's off, so maybe that's what it is.
Commissioner Lark?
I'm just very curious. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of these strategies are well thought out. How, like, given the political context that occurred earlier this month, specifically around an initiative being passed, how did that reevaluate your kind of approach to the climate action plan? Was that taken into account, or was that, did that alter the draft? Because there's a lot of it now up in the air. So can you kind of expound upon that and talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that all of these actions within this plan are flexible enough to change with the local context. So we aren't trying to be prescriptive with the actions. We're trying to make them flexible enough that they can change over time, and this plan might take years to implement. So it is open for changes along the way, and there's a lot of implementation planning that has to happen, and I think it is flexible enough for those kinds of changes. I don't know if that answers your
So
question.
would you say, like, weighing that would be more of the phase 2 conversation? Because right now this is, as we move to something more tactical, having those explicit conversations.
Right, yeah, I think that would be more of the phase 2 actions when you're thinking about actual funding, what this is gonna look like on the ground. A lot of the actions are more around planning future actions and looking at what those look like.
And if I may, do we, the carbon, the greenhouse gas inventory on page 19?
Yeah.
Talking about Everett's contribution to climate change, that's from 2014. Do we foresee updating that at all? Or has there been any changes to that?
That would be a good question for Karen. Generally, the inventories do not need to be updated that often.
Okay.
This is kind of a baseline inventory. I think once you start moving into implementation and you have some actions on the ground and you want to see what the impact of those has been, you might proceed with doing another inventory to see what progress you've made so far. But Karen might be able to answer that.
If I may, just one last one.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel I have a lot more follow-up questions, but the tension I'm seeing right now is that the follow-up questions I have seem very much phase 2 focused as we start moving from broader strokes to
Right.
more tactical. And I just want to know where in the timeline are we going to be able to kind of we as a commission are going to be involved in fleshing those policy questions out.
Yeah, maybe you can help with that.
I think, Commissioner, that'll be a question for the city council.
Gotcha.
Once this moves on, phase one really puts the ball into their court to decide on priorities, to decide on process. And so I think that's another question for shortly down the road.
Roger that. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
I think that my question kind of piggybacks on Alex's question, because when I read on page 14, the sort of the best case scenario, sea level rising, it looks like 4 to 14 inches is on the low end. And I know that we've recently discussed new developments on the river and the bay side, and I'm not familiar with the kinds of strategies that they've had to implement to accommodate this known change in water rising. And I know that our water treatment facility is also right there at sea level, and so I think, this may not be the appropriate time to ask those kinds of questions, but in my read through of the plan, I was happy with what I see here, but I have some bigger questions about existing development and whether the city will be putting together some kind of evacuation plan, or will we be educating people on emergency preparedness? And I mean, this is sort of like a known thing that's coming, and we have these new developments going in. I don't see any planning that's happening in terms of accommodating that water chain or water.
Yeah. Yeah, you wouldn't see that in this plan because of the mitigation focus.
Right.
So the city is doing a lot of adaptation work. There's a hazard mitigation plan that we looked through that had a lot of those kinds of things, like emergency planning and evacuation planning. But they weren't included in this plan just because of the chosen scope and focus on mitigation.
Okay. So those are conversations that we'll have at a later date, at a soonish later date.
Good question. Commissioner Lord.
Electrification's a major component of this. Will we get to kind of get some input from the PUD tonight on that component? Will that be during public comment? Perfect. I'll stop talking now.
Any other questions? Well, I just want to say that it was a really nice report. It was very clear and concise, and it actually reads really, really well on the webpage.
Oh, good.
So that's quite an accomplishment, because some plans are not designed necessarily for a digital environment. I do want to mention one thing, which I think is very important, is the green infrastructure component, and making that recommendation that we really look at our Parks and Recreation for more than just Parks and Recreation. What are those right-of-way and open space opportunities out there that we can re-veg? Because it's been determined the greatest mitigation we have right now is to plant a tree. So that's one other thing. I'll just keep mentioning it. So,
Great.
but.
Thank you.
All right. At this time, do we have any other folks who will be presenting on the action plan? Do we have any more questions?
I read it on the Kindle, so kudos again to the digital format.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you.
All right. So at this time, I think we'll go ahead and open it up to the public hearing. And I have a few folks that are signed up for this particular item. I want to mention, please, to the folks that are in the audience, please do not cheer or jeer or when people are at the lectern. Let's let people have their airspace and time to make their comments. If you do have comments, please feel free to step up to Kathy and sign your name, and we'll get to you in the list. The other thing I want to mention is we are on a timer tonight, so when you see the yellow light, it will be 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and you have 30 more seconds to make your comments. So, all right, and with that, I'll go ahead and call up Troy Olson. Could you please come to the front?
happens.
You're writing the alphabet tonight.
Good afternoon or good evening, Commission members. My name is Troy Olson. I represent Wolf Steel USA. We're a manufacturer of gas fireplaces, heating and air conditioning equipment, and gas grills. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak before you today. In regards to the electrification specifically of this, I come from an industry that was founded back in the 70s in the oil embargo days when people were looking for, when people were looking for alternatives due to high cost of energy at the time. As we have discussed with prior city council members, that won't stop consumers from seeking an alternative. When you're using a single source energy, consumers are constantly looking for alternatives to that single source energy. And what I would ask is that you consider a very involved stakeholder process in looking at this proposed ban of natural gas, because it will also completely stop the innovation that's happening today by my manufacturer as well as other manufacturers in the development of hydrogen as an energy source, because you will destroy the infrastructure that hydrogen needs to go through in order to be used. The other thing that I think I hope the council will look at and the committee will look at is what we do in case of power outages. Will our current grid support these proposals? And if you look at our industry and what we've done when faced with regulation, EPA with wood stoves back in the 70s, we've improved wood stove emission levels 76% in 30 years. There are not very many industries that can boast those types of improvements. That happens as a result of a stakeholder process rather than an all-out ban or severely restricting those alternatives to the consumers. The other thing I'd like to bring up is Hoffman York, a research firm out of Wisconsin, published in late 2016 a research study that dealt with the amenities in homes and what created desirability and what created purchase intent. 91% of the consumers that responded to that stated that a gas fireplace or a fireplace in a home, the amenities that used natural gas were reasons that they made purchase decisions in the areas that they lived in. So this research study is available. It's called the Hotspots Research Study. It's available for anybody to look at. But it's about the only in-depth study that has been studied, that has been created on the emotional value of those amenities and how it relates to purchase intent in homes. We'd like to make the city of Everett, my parents live here, my family lives here, I live in an adjacent city. I want to live in a place that is desirable, and removing natural gas from that makes that far less desirable than it would be. Thank you.
That's what I call perfect timing. Thank you. Eric Shaw, could you please come to the front?
Hi, my name is Eric Shaw. I'm the general manager for 4-Day Fireplace in Marysville. We employ 15 full-time employees. We offer heating solutions for homes, everything from electric to pellet to wood to gas. We do probably $500,000 worth of permitted projects in city limits each year in Everett. I would say of the percentage of things that are desired from our customers for backup heat sources and primary heat sources, between 90 and 95% of those consumers are looking for gas or propane solutions, not only because of the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the energy that's generated and heat in their house, but also, as Troy mentioned, the backup option for when the electricity does go out. We are in an area that does have rather regular power outages, and so having a backup source, not only for heating but for cooking and things like that, is definitely a high priority to a lot of our customers. So we have 15 full-time employees that support their families. We're one of several small businesses in the same hearth industry in this area that all live, breathe, and work alongside of all you guys, and those are primary breadwinners for their families and how they generate their revenue.
All right, thank you. Dylan, and if I mispronounce your name, I apologize. Slutter? Sluter, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair Beck and members of the commission. I'm Dylan Sluter. I'm the Snohomish County Manager at the Master Builders Association. We wanted to applaud you for the inclusion of some incentives for infill and mixed use, as well as transit-oriented development and ADUs, providing more housing types for more people in the places they want to be, near their amenities, near transportation. So we applaud the inclusion of that in this climate action plan. We do have some concerns as well with the electrification, the mandate for the banning natural gas. Our main concern, obviously, in this region is that there's a housing crisis, and so affordability is a part of that. And so when we look at that, we want to make sure that there, again, is a good stakeholder input into this, and to see what that impact on affordability and the economic study of that goes forward before we would consider any type of mandate. And obviously, from the master builder's perspective, we would much more prefer an incentive-based approach where maybe you do a rebate or something like that rather than an outright mandate against natural gas. And again, it's been mentioned, but there's also some consumer choice as well. There's some key points that may be a high selling point for an individual looking for a place to stay. And so some of those options, such as fireplaces and a gas stove, can be a big issue with someone looking to buy. So I think that's sort of our concern with that, and we thank you for your time and work on this.
Thank you. Todd Taylor. Please state your name and address.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Todd Taylor, and I'm the Business Manager for United Association of Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, Local 26 of Western Washington. I'm also a lifelong resident of Everett, and I live in the Northwest Neighborhood, 707 Hoyt. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening about the city's proposed climate action plan and its recommendation to ban natural gas piping in new construction. On behalf of the members I represent, I would like to say we agree with the overall goals of the climate action plan, but we do not support a ban on natural gas piping in new construction. We have a few concerns, not the least of which are the concerns of members of Local 26 and their families, some who work for PSE and others who work for local contractors that install and maintain natural gas systems in residential, commercial, and industrial sites in and around Everett, whose jobs could be in jeopardy if this ban goes through. What financial impact will this have on those members, and what financial impact will it have on our local economy? We have many questions, and just a few of them would be regarding load forecast. Can the expected demand associated with this policy be met, especially at peak demand during the cold months of the year? Reliability. Can around-the-clock delivery be maintained? Costs. What costs will be associated with this policy, and will the customers have choices? Will this stifle growth? In closing, I'd like to say again, we are opposed to the recommendation to ban natural gas piping and ask that more studies take place to see if some of our concerns can be answered. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Once again, I apologize if I mispronounce the name. Kimberly Bustede.
My name's Kimberly Bustede. So I just thought I would kind of say a couple points. I really think that we need a vision for Everett, and this is a good start. I agree with the sea level rise and that our wastewater treatment plant is kind of in that area, and that's definitely something that we need to think about and look at. I appreciate the comment about the green, the trees in our green space, because I think that's really important. The right-of-way by my house, they cut down 6 large trees to build a new house, which was a little bit disappointing to me. With regards to the electricity, we really need to focus on microgrids, which would help our city in times of disasters. So using those solar panels and using your neighbor's electricity and focusing on building sustainable smaller grids so that in times of disasters it's not knocking out the whole grid of the city. You don't really need natural gas to do that. Wood is a renewable resource. Natural gas is not. I don't think natural gas is the way of the future, and I think that you should consider not having the city implement those anymore. So I moved to Everett to make a difference and change the way we live and operate as a community. And so I just thought I would say something in rebuttal and share my thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you. Brenda White from the Snohomish PUD.
Good evening. For the record, Brenda White with Snohomish County PUD. Address is 2320 California, here in Everett. On behalf of the PUD, we appreciate the opportunity to publicly comment about the proposed climate action plan. We support the past and current efforts of climate planning with the city. As the electric utility serving the city of Everett, the electrification aspects of the climate action plan are an integral part to our business, and so the utility takes great interest in its outcome. The PUD's comments pertain to the building and vehicle electrification strategies. They're organized in 3 areas: grid infrastructure, electricity resources, and energy initiatives. First, grid infrastructure. The PUD can plan to be ready for vehicle electrification and new construction electrification as proposed in the draft Climate Action Plan. The utility is in the beginning stages of studying how electrification, particularly if building electrification were to be mandated, would impact our grid infrastructure. The PUD expects that for large-scale electrification effort, it will be needed to reinforce our system in certain places, but not extensively rebuild the system. The PUD has less certainty regarding electrification requirement for major building renovations. Large-scale electrical heating and retrofits could quickly overload specific portions of our electrical system. Close coordination with the PUD would be necessary to ensure grid reliability. Electricity resources. The PUD has 98% carbon-free resource portfolio that's well positioned to accommodate future load growth. Incremental and smartly planned electrification example of future load growth that can be integrated into the PUD's resource planning efforts while maintaining clean and affordable electricity for our customers. Collaborative planning efforts are likely to result in the best outcomes for our customers. To that end, we're starting the planning cycle for our 2021 Integrated Resource Plan, where we will consider electrification scenarios and we'll like to involve the city in those planning efforts. Energy initiatives. The PUD is active in researching and developing electric vehicle, renewable energy, battery storage, and conservation initiatives that support decarbonization efforts. The PUD has been a partner with the City of Everett on electrifying city buses and looks forward to supporting that successful and significant project. The PUD encourages further partnership on decarbonization planning and initiatives. Electrification is central to that core business. In conclusion, the PUD appreciates the bold but measured approach taken with respect to electrification in the most recent Climate Action Plan. The utility supports studying electrification and requests close collaboration on the best approaches to implementing any electrification strategy. The utility will want to ensure that electrification is done wisely through best practices and efficient technology in such a way that optimizes our largely carbon-free electricity without taxing the grid. We need to ensure the PUD continues to be in position to deliver clean and affordable and reliable electricity to all of our customers. Thank you for your opportunity to comment tonight.
Thank you.
Yep.
So that's the last person I have up here. Do you have anyone else, Kathy? Is there anybody in the audience that would actually like to come to the lectern tonight and speak on this issue? Okay. Please just state your name and your address.
Certainly. Good evening. My name is Robert Gibbs. I'm the president of Cory Electronics, located at 11910 Beverly Park Road. We are an avionics manufacturer across the aerospace industry, employ over 650 people at Cory. Generally, the plans here, first of all, we're excited that Everett is developing a vision for the future. And these plans are, I'd say, well aligned, with our vision of what would be good for the both local economy and business in general. I do have some concerns about the potential impact on economic development for the region. For our building itself, the building is 11 years old. It's mostly electric. It's really not a significant impact for us long term. But if I think about what we're trying to accomplish as a community for economic development and for our employees, a few things that we talk about consistently are education, transportation, and really just housing prices. And as we've heard from some that are better experts than I am, I guess I have some concerns because I don't really understand the impact it might have on so many hundreds of these employees that we have locally. It's already a challenge for them, housing is. So anything that would hurt that is, I guess, a concern for us. Lastly, I would just say, as a business, I've experienced in running some other businesses that incentives have been a fantastic opportunity, as well as just partnering with the city in how we might do things better. Real quick example, ISO 14001 is an international standard for environmental health and safety. This was something that was never legislated on us in the past, but when presented the opportunity to employees, they were excited, got behind it, and we made a greater impact on the environment because people were engaged, not because it was legislated. So we would be interested in working with the city on mitigation plans, on opportunities going forward. Don't really understand, but would certainly have some concerns about any legislation around the electrification. But we would love a bus stop. That's one thing we'll be back to, because again, that transportation's a big piece for us. But thank you for your time and the opportunity tonight.
Thank you for speaking. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to speak to this item? Okay. Do I hear a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
Second?
Commissioner Lark,
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. All right, I have in front of me Planning Commission Resolution Number 1916, a resolution recommending the City Council adopt a climate action plan. Any thoughts?
I'm just curious, a lot of comments we heard from the audience, we're talking about bringing up the process, and I'm just kind of curious, I would ask the city council to kind of interrogate that, see what the process would look like. I'm very curious about the comment about hydrogen, and so I would be interested in seeing the value of having a more robust legislative process at the city council level, bringing in additional perspectives, kind of weighing in on that, and that's because I feel like there's a lot of process that got started, but I think this conversation still has a little ways to go, and so just would ask the city council to kind of look into and to seeing what that process is supposed to be like. I'm also very interested in seeing what that study would be like regarding from the PUD regarding the major retrofits, and so those are just the open-ended questions I have that seem to be at that second, more tactical level of conversation that goes to the city council. So I just want to pass those up to the city council for my initial thoughts on it all.
Any other comments?
I would also like to hear more from the PUD. It sounds to me like they're cautiously optimistic that they can accommodate this kind of demand, but without knowing more about what's going on behind the scenes with them, I think it's a little soon to be putting that demand on them. We only gave her 3 minutes. I think we need to hear more.
I think the thing to remember is this is the first step in a very long journey. And I think we're all going to be learning as we go along. So I think we're pointed in the right direction, but I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of work to do. But I think this is a really good step.
And just to piggyback on that a little bit, I think the plan is well put together. I do have some concerns about the strength of the language in the goals related to electrification. But again, they're just strategies and goals and potential actions that will be vetted through the future as we move forward. I would like to see it kind of tamed down just a tad, but overall, I think that it's a good plan, good start.
I just want to echo, following up on a comment I made the last time around discussing equity. I see it only as a benefit, listed as a benefit 4 times, as in the benefits section. So I just want to make sure that that is continued to be prioritized as we go forward. And I also see economic development listed a few more times too in there. So those are 2 things that are on my radar as well.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Back in October, I commented, and I don't remember whether this was in the open house or it was at our meeting, but I questioned the feasibility of a quick phase out of natural gas. I think it's going to be a long-term phase in, phase out process. When I looked at the 2014 inventory, carbon inventory, I think it was the chart in here. Looked to me, if I'm reading it right, that natural gas heating for residential accounts for approximately 11% of our carbon as of 2014 anyway. So even if we were able to wave a wand and eliminate it from residential, at least, this is not commercial industrial, but from residential, it would only drop our by about 11% is my math in there. And I don't think it's feasible to expect it to happen very quickly anyway, because there's a pretty heavy investment in gas infrastructure already in place. And natural gas has been sold for years as the economical way to heat space. And I think a lot of people have bought into that. So I don't think that people are going to be trading in their gas furnaces anytime soon. And I don't see the city mandating that either. We could mandate it for new construction, but even if that happens, it would be a long phase-in period. So that's just an observation I'm making, but I would echo my colleagues up here and say that I think the staff and the consultant are to be commended for putting together a good plan, solid plan, and very easily read and accessible plan for the general public too.
Any other comments?
Thank you.
Do I hear a move to adopt?
I would move to adopt Resolution 1916, a resolution recommending the City Council adopt a climate action plan.
A second.
Commissioner Lard?
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn?
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Yes.
Commissioner Holland?
Yes.
Chair Beck?
Yes. Okay. So moving on to item number 2, Rethink Zoning. Is this you, Ellen, or David?
The ghost of Everett Planners passed.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if he's still in Marysville. Do you know? No. Is he retired now? Okay. I saw his email kind of in the middle of the appendix.
All right, David Stalheim, Long Range Planning Manager. Before we start talking about building and structure heights, I'm going to ask Anjali Day, a new planner in our office, to come up and do a quick summary of some of the online survey and input that we've had so far in Rethink Zoning. So, Anjali? Oh, where did you go?
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Angelia Day, a new planner with the City of Everett. I'm going to give a brief sort of overview of survey results that received during our phase 1 outreach and engagement for Rethink Zoning. So the following outreach and engagement updates are highlighted. The Rethink Zoning engagement process officially launched on October 1st with the project website Rethink Zoning. Phase 1 of engagement activities were conducted between October the 1st through November the 30th. An online survey was created on September the 19th and included 31 questions and received a total of 170 responses. Key themes of what we learned from the community through the survey are as follows. People want to see more housing choices. People want more affordable housing options along major throughways and frequent transit corridors. People want to see more mixed-use development and green space along frequent transit corridors. People are comfortable with duplexes. 66% of the respondents are in favor of that. And triplexes, 52% of the respondents were in favor of that. And while we know that the snapshot is limited representation of the population of Everett, given the sample size, there will be continued conversation through outreach and engagement activities in the new year, particularly around topics on housing as our housing strategy develops, and transit access as the EIS analyzes a transit-supported growth alternative. And lastly, 87% of respondents are residents of the city of Everett, 47% were property owners, and 78% are homeowners. And so that's the brief recap of the outreach and engagement activities of Rethink Zoning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Day. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard.
Very good. Well, thank you, Angela. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about building and structure heights. We've come over the last 9 months or so talk about Rethink Zoning and conceptual levels, and this is the first time we actually have gotten down to actually potential draft code language. So this is the first chapter of probably about 40 that are about to be coming your way over the next year. So something to look forward to, but this is some of the chapters are easier than others. This is definitely one of the major topics, building form, building heights for the city. So, really what this is what we consider kind of a concept. And so the main changes that we're looking at is first off is one of the main goals of Rethink Zoning is looking at consolidation, making things easier to read and understand. And so currently you can find height standards in 10 different chapters of the zoning code. And so what we're trying to do is try to get it in one. So that when you look at trying to figure out what the heights of buildings are that are allowed, you can go to kind of one spot. We would map the heights throughout the city, something that hasn't been done really per se so far. We're looking at a few changes of how heights are measured, and we'll walk through some of that. Looking at trying to synchronize really the heights of accessory structures and dwelling units. One of the things is that we have different height standards for those things that can actually be in the same physical space on the property, but we change the heights based on what's in the building. And we're developing one approach to the transition from residential zones as part of these concepts. So the first is kind of looking at code consolidation. There's a lot of internal inconsistency and complexity. So just as an example, right now in one of our heavy manufacturing zones, the M2 zones, there's 5 different heights that you can find just in that zone alone. And it's spread out amongst 2 different chapters of the zoning code and 1 footnote. So it's really easy to miss the standards and not know that, that's property that's between West Marine View Drive and the railroad tracks, and it's not on the other side of the railroad tracks, but it's also within a view corridor, things like that. And so large complexities, and that's just one of the examples to bring in. Another is conflicts between sections. And the one example here that found as we're putting some things together is conflict between zones. And so like one of the business zones, B1, says in the development table that there's a 28-foot height limitation. Well, later on we passed a new height regulations for core residential area that says that same property can go to 65 feet. So, you know, clearly in any kind of zoning code, the more restrictive applies, but there really was no attempt to try to correlate these things and make them work together in what is the real form that the city really wants. So what we're looking at is for the height maps, the current code maps heights in several areas, in the core residential, Broadway mixed use, Evergreen Way, and in Metro Everett. And then we also kind of map heights, except it's not on a map. We map it by zone. So in our development table, zones have heights with a whole bunch of footnotes to them, or other exceptions that you find in different chapters. And so where we're looking at going is a draft height concept with one map source. And that map source would, in single family and one multifamily, and in the agricultural zones would have heights defined. But otherwise, it's like what we did in Metro Everett. Actually, the height map isn't necessarily by zone, but it's by where we actually want to see what the building heights are in that area. And so with that, we actually have a map. Let's see if this opens it that way. And if not, it did go to it. I'm going to turn it over to Erica Spencer, who's our GIS analyst here, who's had the great thrill of actually trying to map our existing heights. She said she's been doing GIS for how many years?
10 years.
10 years with the city. She said it's been one of the most challenging things that she's ever done, type of thing, is to take the existing code and map it. And so what we're going to do right now is we're actually not going to look at what existing is, but we had to develop that to try to really not make large wholesale changes. And so it was important for us to understand what the existing heights were in order to develop a proposal. So what she's going to kind of fly you through the city a little bit here is what the proposal is. And so let her zoom in and
Go to the first location.
yeah. So there's a few areas where we look at some increases in heights, and this is in the Casino Road area. And so what we've looked at here is that some of the neighborhood business zones had lower heights than the surrounding residential property, and we thought that the character of that area should be all consistent. There wasn't a need for the commercial zones to be any lower than the rest. And so we're looking in that area to be of one zone there, one height, excuse me. Another area of potential change is in the Lowell neighborhood. This is an area that actually has a large mixture of different building heights in there. But part of the issue that's in that area is that the complexity of our zoning tables is that it had to do with distance from residential zones. And even though an industrial zone could go up to 10 floors or something like that, the reality is it never could achieve that because the depth of the property wasn't there. And so this is an area that we looked at trying to get some consistent building heights within these areas, and looking at 4 floors within this proposal. Silver Lake is another area where there's a lot of different building heights, and it was based on zones. So the zones, there's kind of interspersed of commercial zones and residential, single family within there. And so what we wanted to do, what we thought was more appropriate within the Silver Lake area, was to look at a development pattern that was kind of a consistent height along, particularly on the east side of the lake. And so looking at 4 floors along there, some of that also would be further limited when you get actually along the shoreline master program. Rules would apply for building heights within the area.
David, I have a quick question. So particularly the Lowell neighborhood, when you're looking at these building heights, are you considering the topography at all? Or are you just looking at building heights in terms of consistency of the building structure itself?
Well, a little bit of both. And so as we went through in a few of the areas, in particular, where, like some of the industrial areas where they had really tall buildings, and we thought about the reality of the market and not being there, and the slope and the views that might be there. And so we're looking at a little bit of those situations. And so Alan's real title is planning director, but we call him the chief architect. And so when we get into some challenge areas and stuff like that, as Erica and I are working through some of these problems, we'll call him the chief architect, and with his detailed knowledge of things as part of that, and look at that. So it certainly took into play. But again, what we're trying to do, and we're highlighting a few of the areas with potential changes, but we're trying to, as much as possible, try to keep the existing framework of building heights the same. And so not large changes to things.
Last one.
So last one, this is an example in the Delta neighborhood. Again, industrially zoned along the Snohomish River. The industrial zoning, I can't remember, it's like 10 floors, has the potential, but again, with the setbacks from residential zones, a lot of that property couldn't achieve that anyhow, and we didn't really see the marketplace for that. But one of the things that we did do in here is that one of the concerns that we had about going to a little bit lower base height in the industrial zones is the impact for water dependent industry. And so we actually wrote an exception in there that anything that is water dependent and relied on the water would allow another 2 floors as part of that. So we do have an exception that was in that area.
Out of curiosity, what kind of industries would that, are you defining as water, is it shipbuilding, or what do you mean by water dependent industries?
Things that get their cargo from water, barged in, things like that, and so you need a crane or a tower or something like that. There's probably, I think we have some rock crushing facilities, things like that might push the heights.
Yeah, correct. For example, asphalt batch plant that brings in aggregate by barge. Those are generally require some tall structures in order to properly function. And so on the Gerald Wynn property that maybe Erica can point to, at the very west end of that property, there's an asphalt batch plant that's, I don't know the height there, it's, but it is a water dependent activity. They bring in a lot of their materials by barge, and in order to manufacture their product requires a greater building height.
Excellent, thank you.
So Erica, if you could zoom out a little bit again, and so if you get let's just go to North Everett and kind of that area, and then so as you look at this area, so again you have your residential neighborhoods. Zoom in just a little tighter than that. What you'll see, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is some areas where there's some 3 floors, and that's along some of our transit corridors. And so we've identified those areas like along Broadway and Evergreen. So those are single-family neighborhoods, but a little bit taller buildings in there. But otherwise, in the residential neighborhoods, largely 2.5 floors for single-family. And then the multifamily, trying to maintain consistency with what the existing height standards are within that area. So you see kind of that development pattern if you pan south a little bit. So you go, and so Metro Everett, we haven't done any changes from the Metro Everett plan, so all those that were in that plan remain consistent. And as you go further south, you can see really a lot of single-family zoned areas, all the yellow areas, so a lot of 2.5 floors. A few pockets of 4 floors that come in, and those are multifamily zoned areas that are in there. As you look at the Evergreen corridor, we have a corridor within there. That's going to be an area that we'll talk about some incentive heights there. That's also an area that the zoning code says 120-foot tall structures in part of that corridor were possible, but the depth of the property never could really achieve that. And so we came up with a base in large part of that corridor of saving 7 floors with another 2 floors as an incentive height in there. As you look out towards the Southwest Industrial Center, again, a lot of the main building heights, taller buildings out there. We did a little bit of reduction right at the north end of Payne Field Airport. I think the existing heights could go up to 7 or 10 floors, but you can't actually do that. It kind of interferes with airplanes landing and taking off. So we thought we'd get to what was actually a real height so that we don't portray something that can't really happen in that area. And then as you go further south, again, trying to maintain the heights you see again along Evergreen and along Airport Road. We have, and along Everett Mall, we have a height range, and that's kind of an incentive corridor. That's really what we're identifying as our frequent transit corridor that we're looking at for land use and additional building heights. So, all right.
Can you maybe explain a little bit of the difference? Talk a little bit about the change of going from feet to floors.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here and walk through a few slides that walk through that. Not that one. Oops.
Yep.
Sensitive. Okay. So in the draft, what we're looking at is that we'd be looking at height by floors throughout the city. As we did the Metro Everett, we really felt that it's easier for us to say as staff, but also I think for the public to visualize. When you think about 2 floors or 5 floors, people get a better sense than they do if we said 65 feet or 55 feet. People get a better sense of how many floors that are. There are some zones in the draft that both have limits on both floors and feet, and so you have to meet both standards. And that's largely in the single-family zones where we look at 30 feet as a total height maximum, but also 2.5 floors. We're looking at heights measured at sidewalks. Right now in Metro Everett we have that. We're proposing in this draft, we're looking at expanding that to all commercial zones. And so all commercial areas, most commercial areas have sidewalks. It's a consistent development pattern and to measure from sidewalks there. And also in the historic and transit overlays, unless it's a steeper site. Right now we don't, for accessory buildings, we don't measure from the alleys. We actually measure either from the sidewalk or from the average grade. And on steeper properties that gets kind of inconsistent perhaps with what's actually on the property. And so in this draft we look at measuring heights for the accessory buildings for those properties that have alleys from the alley. But otherwise our existing system that's called base elevation is used for all other areas and for steeper sites. So one of the things as we look at this, and so we have an example here of a half-story building, a 2.5-story with 30 feet. We have a definition of what the half-story is. The half-story would include any of the area above that has over 5 feet, and it cannot exceed the floor area, 75% of the floor area below. And the roof pitch has to be at least 412 and usually has dormers to light it as part of that. And so so that would be what a half story is. Provided in your memo in these 2 drawings, kind of an example of how existing heights are done with the base elevation. This happens to be a sloping piece of property. If you get 28 feet sloping piece of property, you could actually build a 4-story building with flat roof. You could have that accomplished there. And these are the different measurements. Again, it's kind of a system that the city has been using for a long time, and we continue to use that system. And in this case, because the basement here is exposed here, this would count as a floor, and so you had 1, 2, 3, 4 floors as part of this. So in the new way here is that you would count floors, and so you would only get 2.5 floors and the upper floor would have to be in a sloping roof. And so when you look at the difference between potentially this and the mass that's there and something with the sloping roof, even though it's 2 feet taller, it wouldn't have as much mass in the upper portion of the building potentially as part of that. So that's one thing that looking at doing and as part of that. One of the other things that is that when we measure at sidewalks, there's quite a few situations where there's a difference in grade at the front setback line, even close to downtown in the Norton Grant Historic Area, for example, is places there. So if you measure at sidewalk, either people will get to build a taller building or a shorter building as a result of that. And so we have something that says that if there's a 5 foot or more difference at that front setback line at the midpoint of that, that you actually go back to using the base elevation as part of that, so that you can't either build something bigger or get something shorter as a result. Height incentives, kind of covered that a little bit going through the map, but the Metro Everett height incentives would be retained, everything that we did there. But the height incentives would be expanded to include the frequent transit corridors. But we would limit the incentive for public parking to Metro Everett. The public parking in Metro Everett was tied to really our requirement or our lack of a requirement to have any off-street parking for non-residential development, and so we want to incentivize people providing public parking. But that's not the same when you get outside of Metro, and so that incentive would only be in the Metro area. And then we added a draft for a new incentive for parks, outdoor, and common areas. One of the common themes that we've heard in a lot of our input from neighborhoods is that for multifamily is to create more common areas and outdoor space for multifamily and try to incentivize that, particularly as you start building buildings taller within those areas. With respect to the height transition from residential zones, the current approaches vary. We have basically 3 different approaches. We have them in Evergreen Way, Broadway Mixed Use, and Metro Everett. The draft looks at a new approach that would be the same across the city. And if we would model it, it would be most closely resemble what is adopted in the Broadway Mixed Use Zone. In essence, what it can be is that the height would match the adjacent residential zone for a distance that varies depending on the zone. So the distance is from 35 to 150 feet, with the industrial zones having a higher standard. This drawing kind of is a kind of a beginning illustration of that. In essence, what you would be able to do is match that height of that adjacent zone going back, and the table tells you how far you would have to go back to match that. This is the column C distance. In this case, this was a mixed use zone to a residential, so 50 feet back from the property line there. And you could achieve the full height in 75 feet, and so that's the column D distance. In this case, the property that I modeled only had a 65-foot or 6th floor height limit, and so it didn't go any taller than that. But the distance increases for industrial zones, and so as you go up, so if this was residential adjacent to a residential zone, this distance would be go back further in essence as part of that. Our current standards, by the way, have this height being here, in some places actually being lower than what the adjacent residential zone is. And so you could have a multifamily zone right here, right now, that has 4 floor limit, but you can only do 35 feet or 20, I think it's in my memo, a shorter building here that's on the commercial zone than you can in the multifamily under existing code. So trying to address that, and again, having a consistent approach across the city. This only has to do with building heights. There are other issues with what happens in the backside of building in terms of building design and form and screening of trash containers and things like that. And so we're only here talking about the height of it. So for next steps, public feedback is welcome. Email. We kind of anticipate it might not get too far. We want to kind of introduce this with the Planning Commission tonight, and with some intentions to come back to the Planning Commission in January. We will be scheduling a briefing for City Council in January, and like we do with any process, we'll redraft and then we'll repeat this once again before we get to public hearings and action on this. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
First of all, I love the presentation. Thank you so much. It's very informative. I have one quick question. Going back to, as we're switching to floors for ease of like consumption and understanding of how high buildings can be, one of the conversations I saw was, or if we go back, we saw the slides in the single family area talking about caps at 2.5 stories. And so my curiosity kind of fleshes out as follows. You know, I think one of the best, like, from my reading, my independent research, one of the best tools for accommodating triplexes and growth was the Boston triple decker, which is 3 buildings stacked on top of each other, which it seems like we've completely precluded from this from our R1 zoning as a triplex model. And is that, so does that, the way I'm understanding, is it 2.5 floors throughout all residential zones, or is it just certain areas? Like, where's the, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, so
He's like,
it's
yes, you
it's
are.
2.5 floors in the predominantly single-family zones. So as you look at areas like this, 2.5 floors there. But what we did along the transit corridors, if I can get into the right place here. Actually, most of that area is multifamily, so let me go up into the Broadway area. And so within a quarter mile, what we did is within walking distance of frequent transit, is that in these single-family zoned areas, we have done 3 floors. And so that would have the ability to accommodate another full floor up there. And so that would be there. But I think that, the issue of what housing types we're going to allow in those areas, that's another discussion.
Okay.
I think that, we are looking at those other housing types in those areas, but we're also trying to make sure that when we introduce those housing types in the single-family zones, that they actually fit into the character of that neighborhood. And so trying to increase heights up to 3 floors where the predominant height pattern is lower would all of a sudden make that stand out and not fit in. And so I think as we have that discussion about the housing types in single-family zones, I think that's something that we should be careful about, is trying to make sure that our height and our design standards make sure that it's compatible.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was curious about was the overall kind of like my priorities and values are making sure we're not constraining the overall capacity or mass of a building that could be built. I think what we just came off of the conversation with the climate action plan was the need to have more denser places to be built, and I think we're getting there here in this. So I'm in no way, shape, or form saying that we're walking backwards. But one of the challenges we saw in Seattle was that they worked really hard to keep that single family character, and then they just dumped all the construction into the corridors, and that made it really expensive because you had to go up to like 6, 8 stories when it was concrete, and then become exponentially more, became increasingly more expensive. I want to make sure that, as we do the Rethink Zoning, we're really making the missing middle, townhomes, triplexes, those still stick frame constructions, as readily accessible as possible. Because in my mind, I think a priority we need to have is make sure that we have the housing to accommodate a thick labor market that'll keep our economy humming along. Because right now, I would argue that we probably don't have enough folks here in Everett to make us economically viable and competitive for like the next century. There's just not enough, there's a lot of talented people here, but we can't house enough talented people here to attract the businesses. And so housing for me is a priority. And that's just kind of like my overall value focus. And so, that's why it pinged my attention.
Right, and And we've already had some of those discussions about housing types and single-family zones, and as we come back in January, we'll come back with zoning maps and uses and have more of that robust discussion. We really need to go back out to the public and have that discussion, and we got some funds from Department of Commerce for a housing action plan, and we're going to hire some consultant services to help visualize some of these options for us as well, and kind of thing. So I would anticipate in the first quarter of next year that we'll do a lot of robust public outreach for that, and then coming back with more of that discussion there. But with the building heights, though, I think that we need to be cautious to try to have that building form and that height fit within that context of that neighborhood. Otherwise, I think introducing those other housing types, it might not go well in some of the neighborhoods.
And just out of curiosity, what would be the kind of expected lifespan span of a building that we're seeking to kind of construct on this? Like, for now we go to this height, and then in 40 years when the building, would that be the lifespan of the building? Do we revisit it and look at a taller one? Because what is the kind of like, is that being factored in at all? Because as buildings age past their ability to be worthwhile being repaired, and could be improved and upgraded at a point when they are no longer kind of worth maintaining in their current state. Am I being clear in my question?
I'm in a 100-year-old house, so I think that a builder or architect will say that it's been past its originally designed useful life, but clearly it's still working. But I think that in large measure as city planners, what we're trying to do is, like we did in Metro Everett, we're looking at minimum heights in some of the TOD and transit corridors, because those are areas where we don't want people to underbuild now, kind of thing. And so we did that within Metro Everett, and we are looking at that again as a height requirement in some of the transit-oriented development streets of doing a minimum building heights in some of these areas and not underbuilding. And so we do have some minimum building heights in the draft here that says don't underbuild, because setting aside multifamily neighborhoods for multifamily, we don't want to underbuild that in terms of both use and building heights, and same thing in our commercial zones.
I really appreciate that component as well. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay. We did have one person sign up for this particular item. Mr. Koenig, could you please come to the front? Thank you.
Alex, I think my presentation I'll show you I have just a couple examples, and I'll show you something that, in sense of my vision and values, so, related to that. So.
Rumor has it you've moved up to the east side these days.
I live here and there. Yeah, I have 2 grandkids now in Walla Walla, so spend time over there. So, yeah. So, second one was born July 4th. So, congratulations. Yeah. So we made a commitment. To do daycare for the first year. So I'm spending time in both places.
Being a granddad.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Oh, hey Jeff. He's got it.
He can't get into it.
Yeah, but we're on this computer, so we could potentially do it here.
Yeah.
If this will read outside thumb drive.
Got it.
Okay, that's it.
Let's take it some. Incorrect.
It's up easier. Hey Jeff, looks like we got it.
No, I just used the, anyway, yeah, Dave Koenig, you have my address on the sign-in. I'll show you why I'm here. I'm going to give you a specific example to show you a building that I think is out of scale and what should not be allowed in the zoning code here. But just overall, the staff is doing a good job of trying to clean this up, and it's well needed. But it's not very often that major code changes are done by community, so this is an opportunity to make improvements that, you know, help neighborhoods. And the goal in changing building height regulation should be to create a community where development results in a benefit and for the enjoyment of the community and neighbors, including views. I'm going to use an example as the city of Edmonds. Edmonds is a community that values its views and has a height standard in single family of 25 feet. They also keep the heights in the downtown down, so the views are for the benefit of the entire community, and there isn't just walls put up. And it actually creates an environment where people want to live in Edmonds, and they value their views and such. Here's the proposal that I'm proposing that's related to what's before you. In the UR one is to go to 25 feet like at Edmonds instead of increasing it to 30 feet. The current code is 28 feet. Also, in the code it has things that can be modified, and one of the things is how heights are measured. How you measure heights is critical in this. If you change how heights are measured, and there's no definition on this, so somebody could come along and say, oh, I want to measure it off at this point on my property, and instead of the base measurement. And so it is wide open in the sense of how you measure it, and could create very high buildings and doesn't give any certainty to anybody. So I think that needs to be taken out of what can be modified. Also in base elevation, there's a definition there. I think filling and grading permit should be removed. The other things have public notices. Filling grading permits do not have public notices. So somebody would come along, they have a lot, they go out and get a grading permit and filling permit to fill it, as long as it's below the SEPA threshold, which is 500 square feet here, cubic feet?
1,000 yards.
Well, how much?
1,000 cubic yards.
1,000 cubic yards. So anyway, if it's less than that, they can fill it, 1,000 cubic yards is a lot of dirt. So you could fill it, come back a little bit later, and then build on it. So I think this needs to be taken out of that base elevation so people aren't just filling something up and creating a new base elevation. Use the existing approach for base elevation. And then also there's some areas where there's actually in the front yard there are accessory buildings. You should put a height standard on those with one floor 18 feet. So this is the example and why I'm here. This is a house that's in a single family zone here in Everett that is a 3-story example, and this is actually a triplex. by function. It was done as a single-family house with an accessory unit, but on the first floor is an accessory unit that's used. Second floor, they put a kitchen in it, but said it was just a bar, and the top floor is a kitchen. So there's actually 3 units here. This is in a single-family neighborhood, and what I think should not, it's out of scale with everything in the neighborhood. Here's an example. Here's a house that's next door, and all the other houses in the neighborhood are 2 stories like this, and you have this building that was built, and the effects it has on the rest of the neighborhood. Judd Marquette, who's the M of Element Architects, they did the event center here and everything. What was walking down the street and says, when do they allow apartments in this neighborhood? And it does look like an apartment, and it's large and it's out of scale, and this was done under the existing code. Here's another building that's just down the street. This is actually a 3-story building. And you say, how is that? What drops off in the back? What they did in this one is it had about a 15-foot drop in the front here, but they built the house and then backfilled in so they'd have a front yard, which is fine. But just to give you kind of the scale, this would not be allowed under the new code being proposed by staff because it's a 3-story and it has a top story on it. But in this case, it fits in the neighborhood, it doesn't block views and that type of thing. And why I show this as an example, this is a very difficult code change. There's so many variations on these things that you don't think, and I think that's why 25 feet is really important to keep the scale down, because in this case, it's a 3-story building, and they just backfilled behind, but it's, you can see the street there, they're just 1 story above the street, which works just fine. And here's the historic, in my last slide, historic example. This is one that was done before the base elevation was, 4 stories. And how they did this is, it was all flat, basically where the concrete is, that was flat. And they basically built a basement and backfilled, and then went up 3 stories from that. This is on Rucker Hill. This blocked 20, 30 homes. So this one individual who built this house years ago, they got great views, but all the houses up the hill, which are all 2 stories, lost their views. And I'm going to stop there. So. I also, I've commented, there's a comment in a letter that in August that before you had any code changes, I just made some general comments, and then I've also commented on the EIS scoping, but that's it.
Thank you. We have one more person who's signed up, Ishmael Mohammed.
Good to be back here. I was here last time, and my name is Ishmael Mohammed, and I have been doing business in Everett for the last 25 years. Now I'm focusing on real estate development and building affordable or manageable housing in Everett. The new changes, those are being proposed. I think we need to look carefully into that. I'm not sure if one height or one size fits all the areas in the zoning. We might have to look deeper into it and compare it with other cities around us, how they have been doing and adopting the heights. We did this in Metro Everett time when we standardized the parking requirement, and that kind of bottlenecks the number of units in any building project. So when we go to heights, I would say that we need to look thoughtfully into that. I presented last time that I have a project that I'm working on, and I have lots of hope in there, but actually it got shut down today. And what happened is, we talk about height 25 feet to 40 feet or 65 feet, R4 zoning, and I went to the Snohomish PUD today, and I said there is 0 setback in the rear alley for my property or this project, and there is a electric lines running right above it. How are we going to handle that? Well, you move your property back 10 feet because we're not going to move our power lines. So no matter how high we allow, the infrastructure around it has to support those height limits. So I said, okay, I met with Mr. Engineer Richard Lothamar, and he said, well, if you want, you can move those lines on the other side of the alley. It would cost $50,000 and you have to pay for it, or you build it underground. Now, I asked, how high are those lines, power lines? They are 35 feet high, the main line, and then the neutral line is below that around 30 feet or 27 feet. So no matter what height we allow or what setbacks we have in those zonings, we will never be able to achieve those heights because either we move those power lines or we take a step back and go 10 feet away. The law is that you have to be 10 feet away from any power line, and the people who would work to build that 10 feet building has to be further away. So while building, it has to be maybe 15 feet. So I'm not sure how we're going to achieve 30 feet or 60 feet or 65 feet of height limits. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. Is there anybody else in the audience that would like to speak? I see Victor coming forward. Mr. Harris.
Good evening, Victor Harris, 3017 Lombard, in beautiful downtown Everett. One thing that I did catch in the presentation, and I think Mr. Koenig also commented on it, was character of the neighborhood. And when we start talking about residential properties, especially those off of Broadway, reaching up to 3 stories, my recollection of the Broadway plan is that those buildings on Broadway are limited to a 5 or 6 story height. Part of that is based on the heights of surrounding buildings that you have to graduate up. You can't just throw the whole thing up. But if we start allowing 3 story homes on Lombard, at what point do we reach a threshold where, okay, you have one property that's 3 stories, now you can move this building up to 8 stories or 10 stories? Is it 1 lot, is it 4 lots, is it 6 lots before you can start increasing heights on Broadway, on any corridor that's set up like that? Now I realize that Broadway is capped, but I think it does open up the potential for change to raise the other heights. Now, that may not be a bad thing, it's just a consideration of how we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Anyone else would like to come forward and speak to this particular item? Any last comments from staff?
Any other feedback from commission members so far?
I'm passionate about this. I think this is a fantastic thing that we're doing. I think since this, Dave Koenig brought up a good point, we don't do this often. And so, is it possible to bring in like some sort of urban economist, a labor economist, a housing economist to come in and talk about kind of the impacts of zoning, or is there any way to get some additional material sent on that? Because, a lot of the data, a lot of the studies we read, like this is the crux of where housing affordability occurs when we start talking about our zoning heights, how much building we can bring in here. And it also is indexed to the capacity for our economic growth. If we want to make sure that we are an area that can continue to attract talent, continue to house talent, and do it affordably, we need to make sure that there's the volume and mass for it. And so, if it's useful, I'd like to put, some additional perspectives into the record on that impact. I don't know what the other commissioners are thinking, or what their thoughts are, or the staff's capacity on it, but, I do want to, see what we can do to put on the record the economic impact in both terms of economic development and terms of housing affordability that some of the, decisions we're making will have.
So, two things that come to mind. So first off, one of our objectives in a lot of the things that we're trying to do with Rethink Zoning in the first phase of this is to not make wholesale planning changes. And so policy shifts of things like that, we're trying to minimize. But where we are doing that, we're trying to highlight that so that we have that discussion. But we're trying not to do that. And so again, the heights in the single-family neighborhoods are existing heights. They're closely mirroring that, and same thing in multifamily in the commercial areas. And so we're trying to minimize large changes as much as possible. The exception that we have is that we are looking at, because we've heard positive feedback along the frequent transit corridors about building up. And so we've heard positive reception to that, and so that's why in this draft height maps, we have a little bit taller buildings in single-family neighborhoods, and also the height incentives along the frequent transit corridors to help address that. We are, as part of the housing grant from Department of Commerce, we are going to take a more focused look as a future phase of Rethink in the 2023 plan update around all the light rail stations and the TOD corridors about what are some potential land use changes to accommodate housing long-term. And so we're going to start identifying those neighborhoods where we could actually build more capacity and do other things as part of that. We do have funds that we're going to hire an economic consultant to look at the market rate for some of that, because what we've heard a lot is the disconnect between what the rents are and the development costs, and trying to figure some of that stuff out. And so, and even Mr. Mohammed's comments from the last meeting, we might even look at some small scale projects too about the infill and what does it take to get these small infill projects. So we will have economists come on board in the first quarter of next year to look at some of those things. But some of those bigger policy changes are intended a little bit more for the 2023 plan updates rather than the initial code changes in this coming year. So we're trying to minimize the disruption, because there's going to be enough disruption with the whole code rewrite as much as possible. So.
And I would add that David mentioned the 2023 update. We will be soon having conversations based on the Vision 2050 plan that Puget Sound Regional Council will be adopting, that will require us to update our countywide planning policies, and part of that process will be new growth targets, extending our planning horizon out an additional 8 years. And so to accommodate additional growth in the 2023 plan update, we'll at least have a number that we know that we're planning for 20 years. Beyond that, of course, we probably need to think more than just 20 years ahead, but those will be the numbers that we'll be planning for, and would anticipate making some changes in particularly areas around the light rail stations and in these transit corridors.
Dave's house is 100 years old, so I think we ought to take that kind of view.
And it's a threeplex, so 3 units, vertical, historic.
Question for you on the modification of the building heights and how that might work. When I read the general statement, it says that you can apply for a deviation as long as it meets subsection C. But where does B come into play there? So you got the general, then you got building height standards that can be modified. So can I only get a modification that's related to a minimum building height and how the heights are measured? Is that what this section is telling me?
Correct, yeah, so, for example, yeah, I think in the TOD quarters, we have 4 floors as minimum building heights, and so we have the ability for someone to ask for a modification of that, and then how heights are measured was the other thing, which you heard the input from Mr. Koenig on that.
So if I am on one of these unique lots, similar to one of the images that he showed that, you know, has a nice street presence and it appears to be a one-story, you know, Rambler or whatever, I'm not allowed to increase over the 2.5/25 feet according to the modification procedures here?
Correct, because that would be a height variance. Yeah, so you could, but you'd have to pursue a variance to the hearing examiner.
And is there variance? I didn't see any variance criteria in here unless I missed it.
No,
So
the
it's
variance
general-
criteria being a separate chapter.
The general
right.
variance criteria.
Yeah, the modification would be administrative process, so the criteria is not the same as variance criteria.
And then what's the type 2 process? Can you explain that?
Notice to neighbors.
Okay.
Yeah. And a sign on the property, so notice to neighbors, I can't remember, 150 or?
150 feet radius from the property, planning director review process, no public hearing, but either an applicant or neighbors would have the opportunity to appeal that decision to the hearing examiner.
Great, thank you.
Just relative to one of Mr. Koenig's points, I think it would be helpful to see in the future the impact of filling on a site and how the new code is going to, if it's going to change that or if it's not, but how that affects the establishment of that base elevation, because that does sound like a kind of important feature.
Yeah, I don't know the history. I read the beginning and it talked about natural topography, so just seeing that about the fill and grade, that I'm not, I don't know if Alan knows that.
1,000 yards of fill is a
We'll,
lot of fill.
yeah, we'll have more conversations and refine the details on this before we bring something back to you and provide.
That's an existing definition, so he's identified kind of a weakness of the existing definition as well. And anything that we're doing right now hasn't changed that, but that's kind of raising an important point.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I would like to say, because Mr. Mohammed brings up very interesting points when he comes to the lectern, and I know it's the dreaded word, LID, Local Improvement District, but if there is going to be an economist hired, and I don't know if this could be part of the duties of the consultant, is there a way to get creative with LIDs for small builders? So we could encourage kind of cooperatives of small builders that get together to try to put in utilities, because I see that as being a big issue, particularly if you're redeveloping in the downtown area, but it is a great source of affordable housing for people who are trying to maximize, you know, the single family footprint and create a duplex or a triplex or something like that. So I just want to plant that seed because I think that's a really interesting concept. I do see utilities as being a problem, the aerial utilities. And if people pull together cooperatively, we could perhaps help the small builders out. Any other comments?
Oh, I think you've done a great job in putting this all together, so thankful for staff for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you. All right, we're adjourned.